Okay, this is part B of chapter 10. Previous to this, we identified the 4 general categories of serial killers, and of course there are 3 subtypes in hedonistic. Again, there's a great multiple choice question. We talked about he because most of them are serial killers, but there have been female serial killers. Probably more than we actually know, but certainly not as many as men. They are less likely to kill strangers than the men are. See, only 1 in 3. They tend to murder for a longer time period and accumulate more victims. Probably the best known is Eileen Wuornos in Florida, who was executed. As we said back in the comfort killers, oftentimes for material gain. So rather than shooting or choking or stabbing, they're going to use poison or pills. And, we said the healthcare worker is kind of a stereotype, but not always true either. All right, looking at serial murderers from the victimological perspective, the social opportunity to kill tends to be a primary motive. And they look at the types of victims and on the nature. Generally, there's a geographical component to this as well. So serial killers will have a preferred anchor point, a base of operations. And then most of them don't kill or don't hunt within their anchor point, but they will in close proximity. All right, mass murderers, certainly not as much attention, not as much data collected, not as much research. We do know that these 4 things, okay, here's another great multiple choice, oftentimes they perceive themselves as failure. They tend to be socially on the outside. They have an interest in guns, weapons, violence, and because they see themselves as failure, they really don't care whether they live or die. So dying at the scene is sometimes part of it, and oftentimes will commit suicide in the event or in the course of the event. The characteristics, they tend to be planned. There are specific targets where, as opposed to the serial killer who chose people on the basis of vulnerability or opportunity. And oftentimes there's some real or perceived loss that precedes it. Okay, mass murders, again, typology, or sometimes called motivation. This is by Jamie Fox out of Northeastern University, Fox 11. These, again, are in your book. There's a great multiple choice killer, so certainly encourage you to go back and read that section. School violence. The big thing is, once you think all school violence is not murder. In fact, it's a very small portion of it. But obviously, when it does occur, and it involves multiple victims, it's like a Columbine, it's going to get a lot of media attention. There are more assaults, there are more robberies, there's more school violence against staff or teachers than people realize, And so we don't want you to think in one dimension that shootings are the only form of school violence. A ton of myths about this. Probably one of the bigger ones is that they're always loners. That's not true. They're definitely not alike. It is not an epidemic. The year of Columbine, school violence actually went down that year. And again, there's a great multiple choice question, which is or is not true out of that list. All right, school shooters. I see a lot of peer rejection, and again, if you remember anything about Columbine, these two guys were members of what they call the Trenchcoat Mafia, kind of a counterculture group. Again, real or perceived social rejection. Cruelty to animals is a common characteristics. Interest in guns and weapons. That's why they always visit websites and look at magazines. Most attacks are planned. There'll be varying degrees of planning. And usually they share their intentions with others. All right, these are the risk factors. And again, you see the social rejection, being bullied, being teased, and again, there's part of the myth that they're always bullying. That's not true consistently. Usually there's some form of psychological problem, a lot of antisocial personality disorder in some of these cases, guns, explosions, fascination with death, And one of the things they do a lot of times is look at doodles and artwork. All right, bullying, and this is important because, again, we tend to focus on the physical bullying, and again, probably because it's the most visible or most obvious. Notice it can take various forms. The verbal also does a lot of damage to the victims, name-calling, taunting, teasing, threatening, and the psychological, which we see the computer bullying to be a lot more, spreading rumors, social exclusion, all these kind of things. We have to give schools credit. They really have done a pretty decent job of training teachers and identifying bullying and all. But it still is predicated a lot of times on the student or the student's parents coming forward. And there's a lot of association with bullying with crimes later in life. All right, school bullying, probably the most common. Again, it can occur any place. Playground, on the bus, in the hallways, cafeteria, school bus to and from, even people who walk to school. The cyberbullying, which is a lot more difficult to control. And of course, we had the famous case in St. Louis where actually the mother of the neighbor girl was doing the cyberbullying, and then the girl committed suicide. And people don't realize that we know there are negative effects for the victim, but also the perpetrator as well. All right, workplace violence. Again, this tends to be kind of take a back seat to school violence. There's a lot of it that goes on. I can tell you from working in industry. Attempt to harm others at work or after work. Sometimes it's more subtle. Certainly saw constructions when I worked in industry, destroying people's property. But that's the difference between aggression and violence. In workplace violence, there is actually an intention to cause physical harm. So people are going to get mad at one another. That's inevitable but are you willing to actually take that next step and intend to harm them? This is Gregory's typology of workplace violence. Again, here's another great multiple choice question. Type 1, again, no real connection to the workplace or the victim. Type 2, former services, former clients, patients, customers. Type 3, current or former employee, dispute with another employee. Sometimes these are affairs, or after somebody's been dumped and the person that dates their ex, and then indirect involvement with workplace through relationship with the employee. Person goes and kills his wife, who's identifying him, or who's divorcing him, excuse me. And again, maybe others there as well too. So these are problem behaviors that are, I don't know if I would say them risk assessment, this is probably more threat assessment, but these are things that you look out for. And again, here is a huge multiple choice question, but people who become increasingly belligerent, they are hypersensitive to criticism, that fascination with weapons again, or violent themes, obsession sometimes, big outburst, and noticeable changes in behavior. So most of the time these are after the fact. We go back and say, oh, come to think of it, he did this or she was doing this, and we saw these changes. So